for more on the passing of the PIB. Mele Kyari, the Group Managing Director of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, actually joins us now to really have a conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, let's start by saying congratulations to not just the Nnpc now, but to Nigerians in general, because we're seeing congratulatory messages come from everywhere in the world right now. But let's look at the fact that under Section 51, subsection 1 and subsection 2 of the Petroleum Industry Act 2021, the Minister of Petroleum Resources shall, within 6 months of the commencement of this act, incorporate the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, that's the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited. The minister will also consult with the Minister of Finance to determine the normal value of the shares to be allotted to the Nnpc Limited. But all of this, let's look at this. By implication, the Nnpc, as we know it today, shall no longer exist in the next 6 months. Have you set a transitional committee to ensure that, there's smooth, and easing of this process?
Absolutely. I think I will join you to say that history is made in this country today. Nobody thought that this day would come. Looking at the history of the Petroleum Industry Bill, it's been around with us for about 20 years. And indeed, the Petroleum Act itself was enacted in 1967, and there hasn't been any substantial change to that law. That means practically, what we did was transforming from a law that is 54-year-old to something new, something that is modern. And coming back to the Nnpc, it is very obvious the provisions of the law said clearly that you are going to transform this company into clearly what is called a Kama company. That means a company that will operate under the Company and Allied Matters Act. The meaning of this is that this company will just be another privately owned company in a sense. This company will pay taxes, this company will pay royalties, and this company will deliver dividends to its shareholders. This isn't the situation today because the corporation has no such obligation today. It means that it has stalled its development, its growth, and its prosperity. And what this bill will do now is in the very short term, within the framework of the Petroleum Industry Act, is that within 6 months, a new company will be incorporated. That means all liabilities and assets of this company will be transferred to the new company. Not all of them, by the way. The bill is also very clear that some toxic assets of the corporation is carrying today will no longer be with it. The federation or the shareholders can decide to keep some of the assets and leave some within the corporation, and therefore you're going to have a much more efficient, much more slimmer, much more commercial national oil company at par with its peers across the globe. So it's going to be very exciting times for this company, and of course I believe very strongly that this company will do better under the new scheme. I also believe very, very strongly that there is nothing better that could have happened to this company than what we see today. And we know this is history made. This couldn't have been possible to deliver under any other circumstance except under the current setup that we have.
But the question is, the transitional committee really, he hasn't really answered the question about the transitional committee to ensure that, there's a smooth transition at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely. When you liquidate a company, when you create a new company, this company must have assets. And this company has owners, by the way. The 200 million Nigerians are the shareholders of this company. These shareholders are represented, for the purpose of this Petroleum Industry Act by the Minister of Petroleum and the Minister of Finance. That means that literally they are holding the shares of this company on behalf of all of us, including myself. And therefore, for you to transit one company to the other, you definitely need a structure to do this. And I'm aware that there is a structure, an implementation committee that is established by government to make sure that we smoothly transmit from where we are today, not just about Nnpc, every institution that is being governed under the Petroleum Industry Act will be part of that process. And therefore, there will be a transition process that will take us through. So yes, there will be a system, there will be a framework has been established by government which will take care of this transition issue. So it's no doubt of it. Right. And of course, within the company itself, as you transit, but I'm sure it's very, very obvious that you do need to do something different, which is that you have to set up your own support system to ensure that the wider external transition process can effectively run.
Well, a follow-up question from there will be, is one thing to set up, but when are you kicking off? Do you have a date? That's one. Just hold on. Help us understand how Nnpc will still be government-owned while at the same time a commercial entity that is expected to pay dividends to its shareholders. And of course, the questions people would naturally ask is, how viable is that? So 2 questions. One, what date? You should have
I will not be in position to give a date because, as you are aware, I'm also part of the companies that is going to be governed by the Petroleum Industry Act process. And therefore, the Honorable Minister of State or the Minister himself, in this case, Mr. President, will give us guidance and they will set timelines for us very, very shortly. But I believe that, for very obvious reasons, you can easily say that, there's already a time frame. Because within 6 months, you must incorporate by law, you must incorporate the Nigerian Nnpc Limited. That means once you incorporate, automatically the processes of transfer of assets, transfer of personnel, and many other things that you have to do have to take place. And therefore, the furthest you can go without doing this is 6 months by law.
Okay, so by law is 6 months. But let's look at something that this particular act was actually silent on, which is an issue of subsidy. So is the new Nnpc Limited expected to assume those liabilities and continue with the record of under recoveries?
Not the least. The Petroleum Industry Bill clearly provides for a transition where petroleum will be sold at its market value. Therefore, it is not tomorrow, but there's a time frame within the PIB to enable that. And that means that when you set up a company governed under the Company and Allied Matters Act cannot be carrier of subsidies. So definitely not. But of course, you must recognize that this is your national oil company. It is true of every resource-dependent country. There are some obligations that you have to put on the national oil company. On commercial basis, this is what's different. Because the national oil company, by law, today has to provide you energy security. Energy security in the sense of providing finished petroleum products to the country whenever it's needed, including some supply of gas into our market. So that is an expectation that is not unreasonable, but it will be done on a very commercial framework.
Okay. I was to get out from you, the bill is now law, is now an act. So, I mean, interested in what next, but let me also add to that. The act is seemingly silent on the question of subsidy. Is the Nnpc Limited, as it will become, in this dispensation, going to assume the liabilities and continue what we have been made to understand are called under recoveries? Absolutely not, and that's the explanation I gave. When you have a camera company, you cannot put those obligations or those responsibility on a camera company. And therefore, somebody will have to pay for it. Who?
Yes, the state, me and you, all of us.
How?
Because once you are selling petroleum at below its market price, and essentially that's the meaning of subsidy, so there must be a framework for settling that. And the PIB, I'm not sure you are correct to say that there's no framework in the PIB. The PIB did envisage that we're going to have a market-regulated petroleum market regime. And by the way, I'm sure you're aware that only petroleum motor spirit is not regulated, is regulated today. And every other petroleum product prices are determined by the market. And therefore, the only one element that is not resolved is the petroleum motor spirit. And the PIB had made provision in a very short term, not definite in the sense that it is within the ambit of the Federal Executive Council and government to decide when that will happen. But obviously, the conception in the CIB and the provisions that in the law is clearly saying that we're going to have a fully...
I'm seeing the controversies really from this whole under recoveries and the subsidy issues, looking at the state of the Nigerian economy and, even looking at the inflationary rate in the country right now. That's the reason why the federal government, as it stands right now, is really, dragging its foot on removal of subsidy completely. So moving forward from what you're saying, that the subsidies would definitely be taken out. And of course, we have to let the market determine how much Nigerians pay. How much of an impact really would that be for the regular Nigerian on the streets?
I think these two things will play out. First of all, timing is everything in this conversation. When will that happen? Obviously, it's not tomorrow. And is there an engagement going on? Absolutely correct. Today, because as we speak now, there are a number of engagements that have been going on. And there's one element that is not resolved, which is that would any removal of subsidy have adverse impact on the ordinary person? The answer is correct if you don't manage it properly. And so what can you do about it? First of all, you must have a market that will develop, with the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act into law, Petroleum Industry Bill into law. You must determine how are you going to transit out of this. Transition means that are there safeguards for market manipulation? Do you have safeguards against potentially transportation cost rises? Is it going to affect some labor issues that you have to deal with? And so many other things that has happened in very many jurisdictions. It's not what you can do in 1 month, 2 months, or 3 months. But obviously, when you make up your mind that the market is going to determine the price of petroleum, then you must put up a process. And that process is clearly determined by what is really practical today. For instance, as an insider, I know for sure that Mr. President's key concern around the price of petroleum is that how is this going to affect the ordinary person? How are we going to deal with it? What excuses do we have to make sure that we don't sell this up? Is it possible to sell at the prices that we are seeing today? And of course, this is very, very obvious and germane concern, but can you afford it? And that's the other question that we'll have to ask long term. But in the short term, those engagements must take place. The provision of the law is such that it recognizes that subsidy will be out someday, but it didn't say that we will do it tomorrow. So there are a number of balances that we do. There's clearly a policy issue for government to say that I'm going to get done with this. But I also agree completely as an insider that you do need to have some structures on ground to ensure that there's no some form of adverse effect on the ordinary person. And that includes, stabilization of the method and how prices are fixed in the market so that you don't have exploitation of the ordinary people. And also, even where PMS is the ultimate for many consumers, or particularly in automobile transportation, there are alternatives to it. There are cheaper alternatives. For instance, we are able to make a CNG and LPG available in our country to make sure that cars are driven by LPG and CNG. Definitely, it's much cheaper fuel, so people will have alternatives. That happen in many countries and many jurisdictions, and therefore those transitions provisions must take place before you can think of exit. Is this something that will be forever? Absolutely not, because it is very obvious from the provision of POBs that there is no one that can carry this for eternity.
And I was seeing that push, being made in Nigeria.
Good.
For the transition.
This law, as it is now, whittles down the power of the Minister of Petroleum, and it grants extensive responsibilities to the Nigeria Upstream Regulatory Commission, that is the NURC, and the Nigeria Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, and that, of course, is the NMDPRA. In the new governing structure or governance structure, what will now be the place of the Minister of Petroleum and the function of both the NURC and the NMDPRA?
I would not like to discuss this. Understand this because I'm aware that the Honorable Minister of State will make comments on this tomorrow, and this will be the best platform to engage. But having said this, when you have dual regulators in a country, which is perfect because I know for sure that emphasis has always been on the upstream regulation to the detriment of everything else. And you do require a dual regulator environment to make sure that the focus is now returned to the midstream and the downstream, such a way that you can gradually push emphasis to gas development and other infrastructure that would build in the domestic industry. Those focus were absent. And therefore, there will be a clear line drawn between the upstream and the midstream and downstream regulator. So to that extent, probably we have gotten it right this time around in the sense that, those situations where emphasis is always on production of oil, as you are aware, if you take a close look at the Petroleum Act as we operate it today, it's clearly an oil act. And there's no emphasis on the midstream assets, there's no emphasis on gas development and production. And ultimately, this is where we are. We're a gas country, but today, we're hugely underdeveloped the gas sector. And therefore, that regulation that is necessary to make sure that focus is returned to this sector that has the quickest route to prosperity, quickest route to development of our country was ignored. And therefore, to that extent, those handshake between the two regulators will be there, and absolutely, even with the National Oil Company. But the fact will now be that at the end of the exercise, and as we implement the PIC, we'll see the value in having these two institutions that will clearly, bring up a new chapter of development in our country.
I do know that this current administration is making a lot of push towards, making the Nigerian economy more gas dependent than oil dependent, because it's more futuristic, looking at the way the world is going these days. Well, let's talk about the Nnpc and the fact that Nnpc Limited will be no different from international oil companies. If you look at the likes of Statoil of Norway and even Petrobras of Brazil. But will the Nnpc Limited be ready to compete with its contemporaries in the oil and gas industry?
Really?
It's a question everyone wants to get answers to.
I understand. What do you say compete? Compete for what? You must have assets, in the marketplace. You must have the technical and the financial ability to sweat those assets and bring them on the table. And then you must have all the skills that are required to put them on the table. And that way, because you're going to face a single market, because the oil and gas industry market is a global market. It's an international market. So how much volume do you put on the table? How much of gas are you putting on the table? At what price are you going to sell it? Who is going to buy? All this is a gamut of relationships that you must develop. As we are today, that's not what we are doing today. Not exactly so. Yes, we have made progress, we have made improvement, but definitely when you have a camera company operating just like Shell and Chevron, Aramco, and so on and so forth, you'll be forced to compete because first, you must pay taxes and royalties like any other institution or any other company operating in the country, in the upstream or in the downstream of any sort. Other companies that will be operating under the company and allied matters. For instance, don't forget that we have subsidiaries that are not necessarily upstream companies. Because there are subsidiaries that will not pay petroleum profit tax, and there are subsidiaries that will not pay royalty. Those companies will be governed under the proper camera rules. So if you put all this package together, for you to compete, you must have assets, and we have huge assets. Today the law is very clear that the joint venture assets of today will be transferred to the corporation. That means on that asset, government is no longer going to contribute money. There will be no cash call from government. There will be no deductions from government, and the Nnpc must find its way around getting cash to put into this business. And if you do this, if you produce, irrespective of what you spend to produce, you must know that you must pay royalties. So it's not negotiable. And then you must pay Petroleum Profit Tax Act. In today's context, yes, we can, because we are clearly a government company, what would really happen is that sometimes you can't refuse to pay because, there are many things that you are doing on behalf of government which you shouldn't be doing and which you will not be doing after the implementation of this. So therefore, those burden, those responsibilities, so a number of projects that we are doing would be on government. Yeah, you're not going to do them anymore. If you'll do it, to be clearly for commercial basis. When Nnpc does anything for government now, we're going to ask them to pay us for doing it for them.
Okay, good. The incorporation of the joint venture assets, hiving of the national, what you call hiving of the National Petroleum Investment Nigerian Management Services, rather, from Nnpc, they were left out. Can you tell us why? And then I think to add to this, we're discussing a while before we came on air. Would you assess the PIA as radical enough to transform the oil and gas sector?
Yes,
those two questions.
Absolutely. When you say Nnpc, I think it's making it narrow. What you're saying is probably those assets that are being operated on the behalf of the Federation that is now held in the custody of Nnpc as agency of government or as agent of the Federation. Why are they still with Nnpc? I think this may be the question that you are trying to ask. And it's very obvious and very rational that you're not going to create another commercial institutions to deal with assets that are clearly run as a commercial entity. You're going to have business that requires skill, supervision, asset management, and so on and so forth. That all the skills that are required to that are clearly within the corporation. As we speak today, we have done it well. I'm sure our accounts will show that. If you go back and take a look at our current and even very recent financial statements. So it's obviously, we have managed this well. Yes, is that the best that we can do? Absolutely not. But is that an improvement? Yes, that's what the PIB promises. What the PIB promises is that whatever Nnpc does on behalf of the Federation will be on a determined cap for a purpose and also at a cost that is to the Federation. This is what's happening today. Today, we lump every cost that we have. Whatever is left, we deliver to the Federation. So it's entirely a different gamut
it's
of...
more business-oriented
it's much more business.
More competitive. And of course, let's talk about a sticking point in this PIA as it stands right now. The 3% equity fund is still a major issue, especially for producing communities. Can you shed more light on that? And also, marry that with the fact that, with this new company, what will your position be in the Nnpc Limited? Have you lost your job?
Thank you very much. I think you're referring to the host community provisions. Let me say it bluntly. This industry hasn't done well operating or having the license to operate. That's what we call it in the industry. We haven't done well in the sense that everything we're doing, in our attempt to make sure that we provide for the host community, we are doing things that probably the community doesn't need. They don't want it. You don't know what they want. But obviously, we call them some kind of CSR projects. We go and build community hall for them, and that's not what they want. They had no control over it. They have no say over it. So what this bill has done is to return that authority, the choice of what to do, to the communities. And 3% of your operating expense is a huge number. Many people are arguing around, oh, it should be 3%, it should be 5%, 10%. And 3% of what? I think that's what most people don't understand. Today, the current, last year's operating expense for the year is about $16 billion. 3% of 16 billion is a large number, somewhere around $500+ million. That's of course, in today's context, is probably bigger than NDDC. That's really what it is. So that's what you are providing. And of course, let's not forget the fact. Also, let's face the bare fact. There are several interventions in this country around how we can take care of the host communities or where oil is produced in the Niger Delta, wherever you find oil. And many of them have practically not worked, and that's reality.
So he's giving more power to the community.
So that they can.
Let me still talk about the host communities, just briefly. The host communities have to be incorporated from what we have seen in the law. How will this be done? That's one. And are the people who the pipes pass through their places included in host communities? That's an argument. And what's the template of the sharing formula?
Yeah, there are very many details. First of all, there will be a board for the host community in every community. And therefore, that community has restrictions. Even for the community, there's restriction of what you cannot do with those funds. And therefore, at least 70% of every resource available must be put into fiscal infrastructure. This is by law now. It's not by choice. Now, nobody is going to sit down and agree that, oh, we're going to use this to buy cars and all this. You can't do this anymore. You've got to do things that will have material value long term for the community. So if this works, and I believe that it will work, ultimately you are going to see massive development in the host communities as we move forward. I think this is probably history made in the sense that we didn't take this approach. I know for sure, I grew up in this industry, probably in many of my youthful years in the Niger Delta. And I can tell you that when you go even today, many communities, you see a flow station 100, 200 meters away from a community, and that community will not even have water to drink. And that simply is not lack of provision, it is lack of application. And that application didn't happen because, we sit in, urban areas, wherever they are, start sharing.
And of course, I still have to go circle back to the same question
and come back to, and let's come back to Nnpc. I'm not going to avoid the question around Nnpc.
We need to get that clarified.
I'm very, very happy and fulfilled today that this company is doing great on your behalf. This company's financial position, moved from a negative of 800 billion in 2018 to less than 2 billion naira in 2019. And I can tell you, this company this year will not declare any loss. So I'm proud to have led this company in the last 2 years. I'm very fulfilled that I have done this. But you must also recognize that the law has provided that this company is going to transit to a new company. When this company is convenient, I will consult my family to see whether I need to apply for a job.
You're using the word led, past tense. Yes. Have you lost your job as the GMD of the Nnpc this new company?
Once they incorporate the Nnpc Limited, it is the choice of the owners of the company who runs it, and it is also my choice if I'm going to apply for a new job.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mele Kyari.
All right, we have this congratulatory message from the President. OPEC congratulates PMB on PIB enactment with a stroke of a pen. You have inaugurated a new era for the industry following years of legislative efforts to strengthen the legal, regulatory, fiscal, and governance framework of the petroleum sector. Indeed, the new law will enhance the Nigerian petroleum industry's reputation, open the door to new investment, and ultimately strengthen its position to meet the world's growing demand for energy. That's the OPEC congratulating
Absolutely. I will expect more congratulatory messages to come in. But for now, Mele Kyari, the GMD of the Nnpc, we have to say thank you for joining us tonight on the program.